Vault 94 was conceived as more than a shelter. It was designed as an experiment about ideals, faith, and whether deeply held beliefs could survive contact with a world stripped bare of structure and mercy. Its population consisted almost entirely of a pacifist religious community, people who believed that violence corrupted the soul and that cooperation, forgiveness, and mutual support formed the foundation of civilization. Vault Tech saw them not as people, but as an opportunity to test whether pacifism could endure when the last lights of civilization flickered out. The vault itself reflected that assumption. Unlike other facilities built with layers of armed security, automated weapon systems, and explosive deterrence, Vault 94 emphasized communal living, shared workspaces, gardens, and places of worship. The architecture quietly encouraged unity rather than hierarchy. Corridors curved gently rather than cutting sharply. Living areas encouraged shared meals. Every aspect of the vault suggested stability through cooperation rather than through command. Embedded among the residents, however, was one exception: a single Vault Tech observer. Their task was to remain hidden, to watch, to document, and to record how the community responded to scarcity, internal conflict, and external threat. This observer knew what the inhabitants did not. The experiment's true focus was not merely whether pacifism could exist, but whether it could survive in a world built to exploit vulnerability. The vault's systems were deliberately limited. No weapons stockpile, no structured security training, a vault built on trust in a world created by betrayal. Despite this foundation, Vault 94 initially thrived. The residents organized efficient agricultural rotations. They used the G, E, C, K, not as a tool of conquest, but as a sacred instrument holding the promise of renewal. They saw the vault not as a cage, but as a temporary ark until the world outside could heal. Disagreements emerged, as they do everywhere, about work distribution, authority, and interpretation of faith, but these conflicts were consistently resolved through mediation and collective decision-making. The Vault-Tec observer watched and waited. Reports noted how rarely disputes escalated, how consistently individuals chose cooperation over personal advantage. For a time, the experiment appeared to demonstrate something hopeful. Even in confinement, nonviolence could create stability. But in the vault's hidden records, a question began repeating. Could this community withstand something that did not share its values? Events outside the vault moved forward. Rumors of safe havens spread across Appalachia. Survivors, raiders, and fractured groups heard stories. Somewhere, there was food, shelter, and technology hidden beneath the ground. Vault 94 entered whispered legend. Outsiders searching for advantage or safety followed trails, questioned travelers, and eventually narrowed their focus toward the mire. Curiosity slowly turned to desperation. When early signs of unknown activity appeared near the vault, the observer confronted an ethical line built into the assignment. Vault Tech had intentionally withheld defensive infrastructure. The residents, faithful to their teachings, refused to carry or manufacture weapons. They believed that arming themselves meant surrendering what defined them. The observer, however, understood the scale of the approaching danger more clearly than anyone else inside. Breaking protocol, the observer confessed the vault's true nature. The experiment was revealed. They explained that Vault-Tec had placed them there not as a resident, but as an overseer in disguise. They urged the inhabitants to abandon absolute pacifism and arm themselves before outsiders forced their way inside. The revelation fractured the community. Some believed this warning represented betrayal layered upon betrayal. Others saw it as a painful truth demanding adaptation. Leadership councils met late into the night. Voices rose, not in anger, but in fear that abandoning pacifism meant abandoning identity. In the end, the majority chose to remain committed. The vault had been built as a sanctuary for peace, and altering that foundation felt like surrendering twice, once to fear and again to the moral decay they associated with violence. A small number secretly sympathized with the observers' warning, but they lacked both resources and mandate. The vault remained unarmed. The outsiders did not negotiate. Driven by paranoia and hunger, they perceived Vault 94 not as a community, but as an asset. They believed the vault contained weapons, stockpiles, and valuable technology. When they encountered no immediate resistance, fear warped into aggression. In their minds, unexplained silence represented deception rather than pacifism. What followed was not a battle, it was intrusion escalating into massacre. The vault's residents did not understand the logic driving their attackers. They attempted to open dialogue, they offered food, they proposed sanctuary. Those gestures were interpreted as traps or delay tactics. Chaos spread through corridors designed for cooperation, not defense. Security doors slowed intruders briefly, but nothing inside Vault 94 was built to confront organized violence. Within hours, the hallways filled with destruction, grief, and the collapse of a belief system that had never prepared itself for outside malice. During the attack, the GECK sustained catastrophic damage. What had once been a device meant to restore life transformed into an unintended catalyst. Processes designed to accelerate ecological renewal malfunctioned. Mutagenic growth spread outward through breached environmental systems. Instead of resurrecting the land, the vault's accident reshaped it, warping the terrain and contributing to the creation of the mire, a region twisted between vibrant growth and hazardous mutation. The experiment, from Vault Tech's perspective, produced its final data point. Pacifism, when isolated in an hostile world, proved unable to defend itself against external threat. Reports would later categorize Vault 94 as a failure of ideological survivability. But in reality, the result said as much about the world as it did about the doctrine under study. A philosophy designed for cooperation collapsed not because it was inherently flawed, but because it existed inside a system engineered to exploit it. The surviving records illustrate the human cost within the vault in intimate detail. Journals describe moments of uncertainty just before breaches. Notes reveal deep inner conflicts, residents wanting to preserve their faith while watching the world give them no mercy in return. Some wrote prayers instead of defense plans. Others wrote apologies to future generations for failing to protect what they believed mattered most. These fragments convey not naivety, but tragic clarity. They recognized the danger and still could not betray their principles. After the massacre, the vault's interior became a silent reservoir of ruined hope. Gardens withered, communal halls stood empty. Symbols of faith remained etched into walls, surrounded now by scorch marks and collapsed structures. The Vault Tech observer did not survive. Their final logs reveal despair, not only for the experiment, but for the sense that they had participated in orchestrating a catastrophe disguised as research. In the long years that followed, Vault 94 shifted from functioning community to haunted ruin. Spore-infested growth crept through corridors. Structural decay, combined with environmental mutation, created a labyrinth of risk and strange beauty. Explorers entered seeking technology or salvage, only to face not only environmental dangers, but the stark reminder of what had once been a peaceful society. The vault became less a place of refuge and more a warning. preserved in rusted steel and twisted vines. Vault-Tech's premise that ideals can be measured like mechanical outputs proved short-sighted. Pacifism, as practiced inside Vault 94, required an environment where mutual empathy existed. It was never designed to function under siege from opportunists shaped by scarcity, fear, and violence. Instead of answering whether pacifism could build civilization after the war, the Vault demonstrated something else entirely. Ideals collapse not when they are weak, but when the world is intentionally arranged against them. Those who later studied Vault 94's data debated endlessly. Some argued that its destruction proved violence necessary. Others suggested the experiment should have included defensive measures, defense without aggression, preparation without cruelty. A smaller group concluded that Vault-Tech never intended to learn from the experiment at all. The company sought confirmation, not information, designing scenarios that reinforced its existing biases about control and authoritarian safety. The land outside continued to carry Vault 94's legacy. The mire stood as a living artifact, lush yet dangerous, teeming with mutated forms rather than restored wilderness. Travelers passed through and felt the strange tension between renewal and threat, a distorted echo of the Vault's original vision. In local memory, Vault 94 became a story about faith surrounded by hostility, a cautionary tale about the fragility of hope in a world engineered to break it. Within the broader tapestry of Vault-Tech experiments, Vault 94 occupies a singular place. It did not test human greed, factionalism, obedience, or survival instincts. It tested whether compassion could stand unsupported in conditions where power defined reality. What emerged was not simply failure, but tragedy built into the design itself. No recordings exist of the final collective moments of Vault 94. There are only fragments, written pleas for mercy, confused logs describing outside intruders, and the record of environmental failure. Yet those fragments reveal something important. The residents remained committed to their beliefs, even in the face of destruction. They did not turn on one another. They did not fracture into violent groups. The community held, not as a defense system, but as an ethical identity that endured to the end. In the end, the quiet remains of Vault 94 symbolize two parallel truths. Ideals alone cannot survive in a world that refuses to recognize them, but their persistence, even within catastrophe, shows how deeply humans cling to meaning when everything else collapses. Vault 94 became both memorial and question. Whether a future world, less scarred and less desperate, might someday build a society where such ideals are not weaknesses to be exploited, but strengths to be protected. Vault 95 was advertised as a sanctuary, a place of healing for people burdened by chemical addiction. To those who entered, it looked like a rare promise kept in a broken world. Clean living quarters, medical facilities devoted entirely to recovery, counseling programs, and a carefully maintained environment free of temptation. Many residents arrived fragile, ashamed of the lives they had lived before the bombs. Vault-Tech presented itself as a benevolent savior offering redemption. The experiment concealed beneath that promise was far more cruel. From its earliest days, Vault 95 operated under rigid therapeutic structure. Group sessions occurred daily. Residents shared stories, confronted triggers, and gradually built trust with staff who encouraged honesty over self-denial. The Vault fostered routine, exercise programs, creative workshops, organized meals, and carefully monitored sleeping schedules. The rhythm was deliberate. It replaced chaos with predictability, hunger for substances with a different kind of stability. The community formed around shared struggle and the belief that change was finally possible. Remarkably, The system worked, at least at first. Progress logs showed declining relapse impulses, improved mental health, and cooperative participation. Residents encouraged each other during difficult periods. Friendships formed across backgrounds that previously would never have intersected. People who had once been dismissed as lost cases discovered dignity in work details and mentorship programs. Underneath the surface, Vault-Tec scientists documented the results obsessively, cataloging every emotional fluctuation as if humanity could be graphed into tidy conclusions. But like all of Vault-Tec's designs, Vault 95 held a knife hidden behind an open hand. Embedded within the vault, unnoticed by the residents and unknown to most staff, was a sealed chamber. Inside were carefully cataloged drugs, chems of every variety, enough to destabilize the entire population many times over. The stash was locked behind security protocols that could only be accessed when the experiment reached what Vault-Tec defined as its true test. Recovery, stability, and emotional healing were never the actual end goals. They were stages in a controlled environment leading to a single, cruel question. What happens to recovering addicts when temptation is reintroduced? Years passed before the trigger conditions were met. By then, many residents considered Vault 95 not simply a shelter, but proof that they had outrun their pasts. Their therapy journals reflected gratitude rather than resentment. Some spoke of wanting to build communities after the vault opened. Others dreamed of becoming counselors themselves, transforming their trauma into guidance. The researchers quietly celebrated. The dataset had matured. It was time, as the internal memos phrased it, to stress test sobriety. The revelation did not come gently. A hidden message was released through the vault's internal communication system, an announcement revealing the secret cache of chems and the location of the secure chamber. It was framed not as temptation, but as information. Someone, somewhere, knew residents had recovered. Someone believed they deserved to know that the vault contained the very substances that had once defined and destroyed their lives. At first, there was denial. Many assumed the announcement was a glitch or an experiment in emotional resilience, not tied to physical reality. But once the vault's internal rumor network confirmed the truth, something subtle shifted. Conversations that once focused on healing began circling around curiosity and fear. Residents gathered in tight groups, speaking in lowered tones. They wondered who had access, who had known, and whether this secret meant their trust had always been misplaced. The emotional fabric of the vault began to fray. Years of recovery had taught the community to speak openly, but openness suddenly felt dangerous. Suspicion crept between former friends. Some individuals insisted the stash should be destroyed. Others, haunted by cravings buried rather than erased, begged leadership to leave it untouched and undiscussed. Counselors tried to center the community, emphasizing coping strategies and unity. But the revelation planted a thought deeper than any therapy session could reach. Temptation was no longer abstract. It existed only a few locked doors away. In time, the locked doors opened. The record suggests sabotage, possibly influenced by residents who believed controlling access meant confronting weakness directly. What happened next unfolded rapidly. Individuals who had remained sober for years succumbed first not to substances, but to the fear of losing control altogether. That fear fractured into anger at Vault-Tec, at counselors, at fellow residents who argued for restraint. Once the first doses were taken, self-reinforcement cycles reignited across the vault like fire tracing along a fuse. Chem use spread unevenly, intensifying old rivalries and emotional instability. Group sessions dissolved into shouting matches. Work assignments were abandoned. Individuals barricaded themselves inside rooms, hoarding supplies. Others attempted desperately to stop them, believing that relapse in one person endangered everyone. Violence became both defensive and desperate. Recovery groups that had once symbolized solidarity transformed under pressure into battlegrounds for moral judgment. The vault's systems were never built to handle prolonged internal conflict. Security measures prioritized containment, not reconciliation. When the first casualties occurred, they were recorded clinically in logs. Incident escalations, fatal interpersonal altercations, breach of rehabilitative protocol. Language attempted to sanitize what was happening, but reality inside the vault was far less orderly. Chaos eroded every ritual that recovery had built. Trust, the central structure upon which the program relied, collapsed entirely. Over time, the community that had once seemed unbreakable fragmented into factions. Some clung to sobriety through sheer determination, forming support enclaves in sealed social rooms. Others descended into constant use, losing rational judgment. A small number adopted predatory behaviors, trading violence or intimidation for access to the stash. The vault became a case study not in rehabilitation failure, but in engineered moral collapse. The experiment had transformed people into data points representing human fragility deliberately weaponized. Eventually, Vault Tech's monitoring ceased. External communication systems degraded. No outside personnel returned to evaluate the final phase. The company's interest had never been in protecting its subjects. Once data had been recorded, their fates no longer mattered. With leadership evaporated, the vault spiraled into complete dysfunction. Systems failed. Maintenance routines went ignored. Food production faltered. The environment decayed around a population tearing itself apart from the inside. Those who survived longest carried both physical and psychological scars. Some stayed sober through the worst nights, only to perish later amid dwindling resources. Others died intoxicated, surrounded by substances they had once sworn never to touch again. The vault interior reflected this tragedy. Therapy rooms filled with overturned chairs, hallways stained with signs of conflict, medical stations abandoned mid-treatment, as though time itself had panicked and fled. Eventually, Vault 95 emptied of original inhabitants. Years later, a new group inhabited the structure, the Gunners. To them, Vault 95 was not a ruin of moral tragedy, but a strategic asset. Reinforced corridors, solid steel doors, defensible position, all ideal for a mercenary organization seeking operational stability. The Gunners established themselves with clinical practicality, repurposing the vault's infrastructure not for healing, but for militarized control. They rarely acknowledged the facility's history beyond scavenging leftover supplies. Yet traces of the past remained everywhere. Terminal logs preserved therapy notes. Murals painted by recovering residents still decorated walls. Inspirational phrases layered with dark irony lined corridors leading toward the sealed stash chamber. Observers who later documented the vault often described the unsettling contrast. Militarized occupation existing atop ruins built originally for compassion. Every hallway carried echoes of a community that had once believed in redemption and of the corporate calculation that had ultimately destroyed it. Philosophically, Vault 95 became a point of debate among scholars, survivors, and travelers who pieced together its story. Some argued that the relapse and violence proved addiction irredeemable without absolute external control. Others insisted that Vault Tech had created conditions designed to fail, That entry into rehabilitation under deception already undermined trust, and that forcing temptation upon people who had not consented to such a test nullified any conclusions drawn. A more nuanced perspective emerged over time. Recovery, as experienced in Vault 95, depended on trust, transparency, and mutual respect. Vault-Tech's hidden stash represented betrayal that retroactively poisoned every moment of progress. When the truth was revealed, residents were not simply tempted, they were shattered emotionally, forced to reinterpret years of healing through the realization that they had been manipulated. The return to chems was not only relapse, it was grief, rage, and existential collapse combined into a single catastrophic response. The story of Vault 95 also raises questions about identity. Many residents define themselves as recovering rather than addicted. But when manipulated into conditions designed to reawaken dependency, they faced a devastating psychological blow. The sense that all their effort had been meaningless, that their progress existed only within a controlled experiment. That belief, even if untrue, could be powerful enough to push individuals back into destructive behavior, as if confirming the cruel narrative imposed upon them. Physical remains inside the vault reflect this dual tragedy. Scientific ambition devoid of ethics and human vulnerability pushed past its breaking point. Cabinets filled with therapy materials sit beside lockers where chems were stockpiled in secret. Whiteboards featuring coping strategies hang near terminals containing Vault-Tech memos celebrating data completion. Every conjunction of artifacts tells the same story: healing turned into performance, monitored not for compassion, but for analysis. The takeover by the gunners replaced psychological cruelty with pragmatic violence. Their presence intensified the vault's aura of transformation. A place once intended to help those at their lowest had become a stronghold controlled by heavily armed professionals, uninterested in the moral questions embedded in their base. They saw only an efficient fortress carved underground, and like many opportunists in the post-war world, they adapted it without acknowledging its ghosts. Sometimes, survivors traveling through the region speak about Vault 95 with a tone neither entirely horrified nor fully condemning. They recognize the complexity in the fate of its residents. People whose worst moments unfolded because a corporation treated addiction not as a medical reality, but as a variable to manipulate. The vault becomes less a symbol of individual failure and more a monument to institutional cruelty masked behind scientific inquiry. Among all Vault-Tech facilities, Vault 95 stands as one of the clearest demonstrations of the company's philosophy. Human beings as test material, morality as optional, tragedy as inevitable if it served research goals. The irony lingers that the vault worked until intentional sabotage disguised as research destroyed it. The experiment did not reveal human weakness so much as it revealed corporate indifference amplified to catastrophic scale. Walking its darkened corridors years later, it is possible to imagine two overlapping histories. The early years filled with earnest attempts at rebuilding lives, and the later spiral where that very hope became a weapon. The structure itself embodies contradiction. A place built for healing transformed into both battleground and mercenary base. Vault 95 is remembered not only for relapse and violence, but for the cruelty of forcing people who sought redemption into a trap designed to invalidate their efforts. Ultimately, Vault 95 illustrates how deeply environment shapes behavior. Addicts placed into supportive, transparent systems can recover, rebuild relationships, and create meaning. Yet when the foundation of trust is deliberately shattered, the resulting collapse can feel inescapable. erasing years of progress in a single devastating reveal. Vault-Tec did not simply observe relapse, it manufactured it, studied it, and then abandoned the survivors to their fate. The Vault's legacy persists as a cautionary narrative in the wider wasteland. It warns against systems that preach healing while concealing manipulation. It highlights the necessity of honesty in rebuilding broken communities. And it stands as one more chapter in the broader history of Vault-Tec's experiments. Elaborate cages where human lives were rewritten, not for protection, but for knowledge leveraged without accountability. Vault 96 was unlike many other shelters in the Vault-Tec network. It was not designed to preserve a community, experiment with social dynamics, or simulate society. Instead, it functioned as a laboratory disguised as refuge, built to study the unpredictable and terrifying consequences of post-war biology. Where other vaults stored human lives, Vault 96 stored information, data on mutated wildlife, genetic drift, and the gradual rewriting of nature after nuclear devastation. The facility was staffed by only 5 people. That number alone revealed the true nature of the experiment. Vault-Tec had no intention of creating a sustainable society inside. The staff operated the vault as scientists rather than inhabitants, expected to monitor specimens, document results, and develop countermeasures against emergent threats that could potentially reshape entire regions. Their mission sounded noble in theory: study mutations, engineer defenses, and someday provide tools capable of keeping survivors safe from the monstrous forms created by radiation. The vault systems reflected an obsession with containment. Thick observation glass-lined laboratories where mutated creatures were housed, sedated, or dissected. Isolation chambers held specimens ranging from insects to large predators, each subjected to controlled exposure experiments. Automated feeding arms delivered food through sealed slots. Sterilization fields bathed entryways in harsh light. Everywhere, machines hummed with quiet precision, an industrial symphony orchestrated to maintain distance between researchers and the dangers they studied. Yet beneath this sterile environment lay layers of secrecy. The staff had clearance to operate the systems, but not to understand every security protocol integrated into the vault. A separate set of directives, unseen by those inside, governed automated punishment mechanisms designed to eliminate workers if their results failed to meet arbitrary quotas. The project merged scientific ambition with bureaucratic cruelty, research tied not simply to progress, but to performance metrics enforced by lethal design. Early logs from the vault reveal a sense of professional optimism. The staff documented mutated bears exhibiting abnormal bone density, wolves displaying heightened aggression, and insects capable of surviving doses of radiation previously believed unsurvivable. The team spoke clinically, analyzing behavioral shifts and DNA alterations. They saw opportunity in disaster. Nature adapting at frightening speed, rewriting itself into something both alien and strangely resilient. If these mutations could be understood, humanity might gain the tools needed to defend settlements without constant fear. But the vault demanded more than observation. It demanded intervention. Genetic engineering programs were initiated to develop countermeasures, engineered viruses, tailored toxins, and modified microbes meant to neutralize mutated creatures. The staff was tasked with walking a razor's edge between defense and further mutation. Their work required the creation of organisms capable of selectively targeting threats without spreading uncontrollably. The risk weighed heavily, yet the facility's automated systems constantly reminded them of quotas. Productivity reports tracked specimen testing, successful formulations, and viable prototypes, Failure was not simply recorded, it was judged. The vault's automated security protocols enforced that judgment with precision. If quotas were not met, or if tampering with certain systems occurred, Vault Tech classified the lapse as sabotage or incompetence. Defensive turrets, robotic enforcement units, and internal lockdown procedures activated without negotiation. The staff lived under constant surveillance and the unspoken threat that their failures, even those born from ethical hesitation, might be punished not by reprimand, but by execution. The line between scientist and prisoner blurred. Despite pressure, the researchers developed their own morale. They bonded through routine, shared meals, quiet conversations, moments of dark humor about the absurdity of working in a facility where the walls themselves seemed to judge them. Their personal diaries reveal conflicting emotions: pride in their research, unease about the vault's hidden intentions, and loneliness sharpened by isolation. The world outside had ended, and their entire universe had shrunk to laboratories, containment cells, and the glow of terminal screens. The specimens evolved. At first, most mutations followed predictable patterns: hardened skin, increased resistance to radiation, heightened aggression. But as years passed, the vault encountered organisms that blended adaptation with intelligence. Certain predators began testing enclosures, mapping patrol routes of automated security drones, and learning to exploit the smallest mechanical flaws. These were not simple beasts shaped by random mutation. They were creatures learning to survive in environments never meant for them. The research response intensified. New containment strategies were introduced. Tranquilizer compounds became more potent. Gene therapy experiments leaned toward aggressive modification rather than restraint. The vault's purpose shifted from observation to containment race, scientists trying desperately to stay ahead of evolution that refused to slow down. For the automated systems, however, there was no distinction between ethical concern and inefficiency. Work fell behind quotas. Warnings escalated. The reality that the vault might one day fail became unavoidable. One of the researchers eventually discovered classified engineering schematics indicating the facility's true contingency protocols. If the vault's inhabitants attempted to escape, if they failed to complete designated research milestones, or if they tried to override automated security, the vault would deploy drastic measures, shutting off key life support sections, triggering lockdown zones, or activating automated executions disguised as containment safeguards. The revelation collapsed morale. The staff understood they had been placed in a sealed loop of expectation and punishment, never intended to survive beyond the project's usefulness. Trust in Vault Tech evaporated. The team confronted an impossible calculation: continue the research under mortal coercion or defy the system and invite lethal reprisals. As creature containment problems worsened, escape began to feel like a moral obligation, not merely for survival, but to prevent the vault's most dangerous experiments from spreading. Plans formed quietly through whispered conversations. Security systems were studied. Automated response times were mapped. Routes to the surface were considered with growing desperation. The escape attempt did not unfold as intended. The facility detected tampering almost immediately. Lockdown shutters slammed into place. Alarms shrieked through sterile corridors. Turrets activated with clinical efficiency. Automated announcements framed the scientists not as prisoners resisting unethical conditions, but as saboteurs threatening vital research. The vault transitioned into full hostile mode. In the chaos, containment barriers weakened. Years of careful monitoring fractured in moments, and some of the test subjects exploited the opportunity. Creatures bred within cages, designed for scientific study, began slipping through compromised infrastructure. Doors jammed half open, power cycles failed. The vault's carefully orchestrated ecosystem destabilized at every level. The automated security system pursued the scientists relentlessly, while the creatures moved unpredictably, creating a nightmare scenario in which every hallway contained a new threat. The escape attempt turned into a deadly labyrinth of malfunctioning defenses and relentless biological experiments. None of the vault's original researchers survived. With the staff gone, control systems switched to autonomous operational mode. The vault treated its escaped specimens not as living organisms needing control, but as variables in a simulation continuing without human supervision. Creatures adapted to abandoned laboratories, reproduced in the labyrinthine spaces, and further mutated within the vault's unique environment. Without daily oversight, the facility no longer represented research. It became an evolving habitat where technology and mutation collided endlessly. The most haunting irony lay in the fact that Vault Tech had hoped Vault 96 would produce countermeasures to mutated life. Instead, the vault inadvertently became a source of further biological anomalies. The very containment systems designed to control nature became incubators, accelerating its transformation. The creatures that emerged were not merely dangerous. They represented unpredictable branches of evolution, shaped by radiation, fear, confinement, and endless adaptation. Travelers encountered Vault 96 years later only through rumor. Stories described a silent structure filled with echoes, its exterior marked by remnants of scientific insignia. Those who ventured inside reported corridors scratched by claws, laboratories overrun with organic growth, and automated defenses that still operated with soulless efficiency. The vault continued enforcing rules meant for people who no longer existed, as if unable to accept that its mission had already failed. Philosophically, Vault 96 posed unsettling questions. Humanity had attempted to understand nature by trapping it, manipulating it, and turning it into research material. Yet nature refused to remain predictable. After the bombs, evolution accelerated beyond human calculation, producing creatures that challenged assumptions about control itself. Vault 96 represented both ambition and arrogance, a belief that science, when sealed underground, could remain separate from the world it studied. In reality, the vault simply mirrored the wasteland above. Both had become laboratories without consent. Scholars later analyzed the vault's logs and debated its ethical implications. Some believed the research might have eventually produced breakthroughs capable of saving countless settlements. Others argued that the facility's automation, secrecy, and coercion undermined any moral justification. To them, Vault-Tec had transformed its scientists into expendable assets, forced to produce solutions under threat rather than guided by the responsibilities that normally accompany research. Beyond the intellectual debate, Vault 96 held emotional resonance. It symbolized isolation taken to its extreme. 5 individuals tasked with cataloging the end of nature while slowly realizing they had been placed inside a system that cared only for results. Their failure did not come from negligence or incompetence, but from a structure that demanded progress faster than reality allowed. Their attempts to escape marked not cowardice, but a recognition that the experiment itself had become dangerous to the world. In the broader network of Vault experiments, Vault 96 connected to a recurring theme: humanity's attempt to dominate forces it only partially understood. Other vaults tested social constructs, psychology, and governance. Vault 96 tested the boundaries of biology. Where the former revealed how fragile communities are under pressure, this vault revealed how unpredictable nature becomes when treated strictly as an object to control. Today, Vault 96 stands as both ruin and warning. The automated systems still hum. The mutated creatures, still lurk in the shadows of laboratories designed to cage them. Terminal screens still display unfinished research logs alongside quota alerts addressed to people long since gone. The vault did not end. It merely continued without purpose, driven by programs too rigid to accept finality. In that ongoing motion lies a quiet tragedy. Vault-Tec designed Vault 96 to protect humanity from the evolving threats of a post-nuclear world. Instead, it demonstrated that unchecked systems, both biological and technological, grow beyond the intentions of those who create them. The story of Vault 96 is not only about monsters, it is about the consequences of assuming that survival can be engineered without acknowledging the limits of control. Vault 101 was founded on a promise that sounded comforting on the surface and quietly ominous beneath it. The vault would never open. Unlike other facilities built as temporary shelters until the world stabilized, Vault 101 was designed as a closed ecosystem meant to remain sealed indefinitely. Its inhabitants grew up believing that everything beyond those reinforced doors was chaos beyond comprehension, a wasteland their ancestors had wisely chosen to leave behind forever. Inside, order replaced uncertainty, routine replaced exploration, and the overseer replaced the outside world as the ultimate source of authority. The architecture reflected this philosophy. Corridors were narrow but meticulously maintained. Schoolrooms trained children not only in mathematics and science, but in doctrine. The overseer knew best. The vault provided everything necessary, and the outside world represented only danger and death. Posters reinforced obedience through gentle slogans rather than overt threats. A deliberate sense of security wove through every part of life. Generations lived and died, believing the vault was both cradle and coffin, the only possible home humanity still possessed. Central to the experiment was power. In Vault 101, the overseer received effectively limitless authority. The position carried oversight of all operations: food distribution, maintenance, education, family assignments, discipline, and security. There were no elections. There were no councils. Any challenge to authority, no matter how small, risked punishment. The residents internalized a culture of quiet respect, cautious disagreement, and whispered conversations held away from cameras that were rumored, sometimes accurately, to monitor everything. Overseer Alphonse Almodovar inherited not simply a title, but a role designed to isolate its holder psychologically, as thoroughly as it isolated the vault physically. The archives indicate that Vault-Tec intended this loneliness as part of the test. A single leader, trapped in an unending guardianship over a sealed population, would be observed for signs of paranoia, benevolence, tyranny, or collapse. The community was the laboratory. The overseer was both subject and instrument. Initially, Almodovar maintained strict interpretation of the vault's mission. He enforced regulations firmly but consistently, ensuring food reserves remained steady and maintenance cycles were never neglected. He kept the vault entirely cut off from the wasteland, even as years passed and the idea of the world outside transformed from memory into myth. His daughter, Amada, grew up watching him balance duty with the emotional distance that came from believing every decision carried life or death significance. Quiet changes began when the overseer authorized limited scouting missions, a contradiction to the vault's never-open policy carried out in secrecy. The official explanation, stored in encrypted logs, framed these missions as necessary risk assessments. Almodovar feared that refusing to gather information left the vault blind in a world that might evolve unpredictably. Unofficially, curiosity and doubt had begun eroding the absolute certainty the experiment required. Knowledge Once outside the overseer's doctrine, slipped quietly back in, the arrival of James marked a turning point. Recruited from the wasteland during one of these secret excursions, he was brought in not as a prisoner, but as a doctor whose expertise could strengthen the vault's longevity. His presence contradicted decades of propaganda. He was living proof that the outside world contained survivors, intelligent, skilled, and not immediately hostile. Integrating him required careful deception. Residents were told James had always been one of them, a narrative woven so thoroughly into community life that few questioned it. James worked quietly, tending to the ill, assisting with research, and nurturing a sense of curiosity in his child. He never directly undermined the overseer, but his worldview, shaped beyond the vault, subtly contrasted against Vault 101's controlled culture. He talked about possibility rather than confinement. He taught science in ways that encouraged questions rather than repetition. His presence planted seeds the overseer couldn't entirely track or suppress. When James eventually decided to leave, his choice shattered the fragile equilibrium. He escaped through secured pathways known only to personnel with high-level clearance, bypassing systems designed expressly to prevent such an event. The overseer interpreted the escape as treason, not only because of personal betrayal, but because it demonstrated publicly that leaving the vault was possible. Ideas are difficult to contain once they become visible. Authority, long seen as unquestionable, suddenly appeared fallible. The consequences cascaded quickly. Security forces intensified surveillance. Interrogations grew harsher, and previously benign regulations were reinterpreted to justify crackdowns. Resistance emerged not as organized rebellion, but as subtle refusal. Residents quietly helping one another, withholding information, or questioning rules in ways previously unthinkable. The overseer responded by tightening control further, convinced that only absolute authority could preserve safety and prevent collapse. The situation escalated into conflict. Long-standing tensions between generational obedience and inherited curiosity finally erupted. Some residents believed total loyalty was the only rational choice in a world they had never seen. Others suspected that their lives had been shaped by deception and manipulation. Families divided along ideological lines. Friendships strained. The vault, which had existed for decades as a stable community, transformed overnight into contested territory. The civil struggle that followed was chaotic, characterized less by grand revolutionary gestures and more by emotional strain, fear, and sudden violence in spaces once devoted to routine. People accustomed to orderly schedules and work assignments found themselves facing lockdowns, armed security patrols, and emergency announcements. Panic replaced predictability. The myth of Vault 101 as an unbreakable sanctuary dissolved in real time, leaving behind the frightening realization that its greatest threat came not from outside, but from within. Historically, Vault 101 offers rare clarity into the consequences of isolation transformed into ideology. Unlike other vaults, whose failures came from sabotage, environmental disaster, or external invasion, this one destabilized because the very premise of permanent confinement clashed with human nature's inclination toward exploration and autonomy. Over time, questions can become as corrosive as radiation. When every aspect of truth is controlled by a single authority, doubt eventually becomes inevitable, even among the loyal. The overseer's internal records show a man convinced he bore a sacred responsibility. He did not perceive himself as tyrannical. In his mind, every restrictive measure protected the vault from decay, internal chaos, or external threat. He viewed dissent as contagious disease rather than legitimate expression. By the time civil conflict emerged, he believed compromise would endanger the entire population. In his eyes, control equaled survival. Yet that belief contained its own undoing. The more he tightened control, the more distrust flourished. Absolute authority crushed trust instead of strengthening it. The experiment, from Vault-Tec's perspective, generated precisely the outcome its creators likely anticipated: a closed ecosystem where power concentrated so completely that it eventually fractured the society it was meant to protect. When the vault finally destabilized, the myth of permanent isolation collapsed entirely. The sealed doors, once symbols of security, became evidence that the residents had been denied agency for generations. For some, entering the wasteland represented liberation. For others, it was exile from the only reality they had ever known. Vault 101 ceased functioning as a controlled experiment the moment its people realized they were participants, not citizens. Years later, Vault 101 exists in memory as both sanctuary and prison. It preserved life, food, water, medicine, education, long after the world outside burned. But it also demonstrated the psychological cost of indefinite confinement: paranoia, rigidity, suppressed individuality, and eventual conflict. Generations of people lived without ever choosing where they lived, what truth they believed, or whether survival required obedience. The vault's logs and abandoned terminals tell a story that reads less like a disaster and more like slow erosion. Trust eroded first, certainty followed. Authority, once absolute, grew brittle, and finally, the illusion of permanence shattered under the weight of human will, curiosity, and grief. Vault 101 ultimately illustrates a central theme buried beneath many Vault-Tec experiments. Systems built entirely on control may endure for a time, but they break the moment awareness enters the equation. The people were never the flaw. The flaw was believing a society could thrive forever without transparency, choice, or the possibility of change. Vault 106 represented one of Vault-Tec's most disturbing medical experiments, a study not of survival, governance, or biology, but of perception itself. The vault's defining feature was hidden in its air filtration system. 10 days after the doors sealed, psychoactive compounds were scheduled to release automatically into the atmosphere, not in response to crisis, malfunction, or command, but as a predetermined phase of the experiment. No warning was provided to the residents. The gas arrived as silently as oxygen, inhaled during sleep, meals, and ordinary conversation. Before the release, Vault 106 resembled many other facilities. Families adapted to new routines. Technicians maintained power generators and hydroponic farms. Inhabitants tried to preserve normalcy by organizing clubs, social gatherings, and work shifts. People decorated living quarters with mementos from the old world, reminders of neighborhoods and childhood homes now erased. There was fear, certainly. The shock of the war lingered in quiet conversation, but also determination to create some version of community inside steel walls. Vault-Tec's internal documentation never framed this population as a community. It referred to them as subjects. The gas, tested only in tightly monitored laboratory environments prior to deployment, had known properties. It induced vivid hallucinations, emotional volatility, paranoia, and dissociative episodes. Vault-Tec wanted to observe how a closed population would function when reality itself became unstable. Whether hierarchies would shift, social cohesion would fracture, or artificial worlds would form inside the minds of its residents. 10 days after sealing, the change began. At first, symptoms appeared subtle. A handful of residents reported unusual dreams. Others described a sense of drifting during conversations, as though losing track of time. Supervisors chalked it up to stress, isolation, and the psychological shock of nuclear devastation. Nobody suspected that the vault's environment itself had been altered. The filtration system registered no abnormal readings because the gas had been programmed to appear as an accepted atmospheric component. Then hallucinations intensified. Residents began hearing familiar voices calling their names from empty hallways, friends who had died in the war, parents they knew could not possibly be alive. Some individuals claimed to see sunlight bleeding through cracks in the ceiling, impossibly bright and warm. Others reported glimpsing figures moving just beyond corners, barely visible and always out of reach. Because the visions felt intensely personal, many initially hid them, fearing stigma or official reprimand. The first documented violent incident occurred when two technicians argued over a maintenance report that one insisted contained scripted hidden messages. The altercation ended with injuries and a formal disciplinary hearing. Security personnel interpreted the event as emotional strain rather than chemical influence. The vault continued operating, unaware that perception itself had fractured across the population. As weeks turned into months, the gas remained constant. Hallucinations layered over daily life, warping social relationships, reshaping collective memory, and distorting authority. Several residents became convinced that hidden factions were plotting to sabotage vital systems. Others believed there were false residents planted among them. Rumors spread about secret tunnels, concealed enemies, and invisible surveillance beyond the vault's official infrastructure. The overseer issued announcements urging calm, but his voice, filtered through the same compromised air, sounded increasingly threatening to some listeners and eerily distant to others. Reality splintered into parallel narratives that rarely aligned. One group formed around the belief that the vault was under constant external attack and that unseen invaders were testing the population. Their paranoia drove them to barricade corridors, seize supplies, and interrogate neighbors. Another faction believed the vault had never truly sealed, that they were living inside a simulation created to evaluate community trust. For them, disobedience became a method of waking up. Others drifted into detached, dreamlike states, wandering aimlessly down corridors, muttering to people nobody else could see. The overseer's authority deteriorated as perception diverged. Security cautiously detained individuals, displaying severe symptoms, but without understanding the cause. Treatment amounted to confinement rather than care. The number of detainees rose faster than available cells. Medical personnel, who themselves inhaled the same hallucinogenic gas, struggled to interpret symptoms within coherent frameworks. Their diagnoses varied wildly. Some labeled the behaviors psychotic breaks from trauma. Others believed they were witnessing spiritual visions. The vault's living environment grew increasingly unpredictable. A resident might be cooking in the cafeteria one moment and screaming at an invisible threat the next. Children played games that merged memory and illusion. Some insisted the vault's corridors led to fields, oceans, or bustling cities they could almost see. The line between imagination and delusion blurred beyond recognition. Conversations became riddled with contradictions, two people describing the same event with entirely different emotional truths. As violence escalated, so did isolation. Doors were locked not only by security protocols, but by fear. Neighbors avoided neighbors. The communal trust essential for survival disintegrated Without cooperation, maintenance schedules faltered. Hydroponics went neglected. Water quality dipped. Every technical oversight amplified stress, reinforcing hallucinations of conspiracy and sabotage. The vault slipped into a feedback loop. Instability bred fear. Fear intensified hallucinations, and hallucinations justified increasingly desperate measures. Fragments of surviving logs illustrate the descent. A technician scribbled that the vault walls were breathing. Another entry described conversations with a deceased spouse who offered calming reassurance, advice that led the writer to disconnect critical life support monitors because the machines needed rest. A security officer recorded that intruders disguised as residents were infiltrating the vault. Later inspection revealed he had been stalking ordinary civilians. The gas did not create monsters. It forced people to interpret reality through lenses shaped by grief, trauma, and compulsion, magnifying everything unresolved inside them. Over time, leadership dissolved entirely. Some security officers abandoned duty, disappearing into hallucinated worlds more comforting than truth. Others clung rigidly to procedures, becoming authoritarian out of terror rather than logic. The overseer's final known directive ordered the locking of multiple sectors. The command succeeded, but instead of preserving safety, it trapped residents in confined sections with dwindling food and deteriorating mental states. Panic spiraled into tragedy. The ultimate fate of Vault 106's original population remains unclear, partly because the gas continued dispersing for nearly 2 centuries. Archaeological surveys and later intrusion by wasteland explorers suggest that most residents either died from internal violence, starvation, or complications resulting from irrational tampering with infrastructure. A smaller number may have survived in fragmented communities inside the vault, living in perpetual hallucination cycles that blurred memory into dream. Their perspective would have contained no clear before or after, only shifting illusions. Long after society collapsed, the gas still lingered. Explorers who entered the vault experienced vivid hallucinations almost immediately. They reported seeing lost friends, childhood homes, or visions of themselves in different timelines. Some encountered illusions of safety that lured them deeper into hazardous corridors. Others confronted nightmarish distortions of the vault itself, endless looping hallways, rooms that changed size, flickering lights that seemed to pulse intentionally. The psychological residue of the experiment extended across generations, turning Vault 106 into a place where reality held little authority. The ethical implications of the vault remain staggering. Vault-Tec did not design the gas as a treatment, nor as a weapon against external enemies. It was built to observe psychological collapse as a scientific phenomenon. The company engineered confusion and documented it as data. No contingency plans existed for reversing the effects or preserving mental health. The experiment equated experience with expendability, reducing residents to living test instruments whose suffering was classified as behavioral response. In scholarly debates, Vault 106 often represents the extreme end of Vault-Tec's philosophy, science untethered from responsibility. Unlike other vaults, where moral ambiguity existed or flawed intentions could still theoretically serve greater good, this experiment lacked redeeming justification. It neither protected humanity nor prepared it. It simply confirmed that when perception fractures, society collapses quickly and often irreversibly. There is a haunting subtlety in Vault 106's design. The experiment did not directly command violence. It did not instruct residents to harm one another, nor did it engineer scarcity. Instead, it altered perception, proving that reality, fragile and easily manipulated, is the foundation upon which all structures of trust depend. Once that foundation erodes, even communities rich in resources disintegrate. People stop believing each other. They stop believing themselves. Decisions lose coherence. Fear becomes the only remaining constant. The vault's legacy extends beyond medical analysis or historical curiosity. It demonstrates that survival requires more than food, shelter, and protected walls. It demands shared understanding, a consensus reality where people trust that what they see and feel can be validated by others. Remove that common ground, and cooperation evaporates regardless of how advanced the systems supporting life might be. Inside Vault 106, every human flaw magnified, nostalgia deepened into delusion, anxiety transformed into hostility, grief manifested as obsession with ghosts. The experiment did not create these emotions, it intensified them until they governed behavior entirely. What remained after the collapse was not simply a failed vault, but a silent labyrinth of fractured identities that never received closure. Even now, the vault stands as an unsettling echo. Broken terminals flicker with partial reports. Hallways bear scars from panicked confrontations. Air still carries faint traces of the original compound, enough to create momentary distortions for anyone reckless or desperate enough to enter. Each step inside becomes a negotiation with memory, illusion, and fear, a confrontation with the idea that the mind itself, rather than any enemy, may be the most dangerous force in a sealed world. Vault 106 reveals something fundamental about the cost of experimentation without empathy. Once reality is tampered with, restoration becomes nearly impossible. The vault did not end in a single catastrophic moment. It dissolved slowly, like a dream fading into nightmare, one perception at a time. Vault 108 is remembered less for policy or ideology than for something stranger and more unsettling. The repetition of a single name echoing through steel corridors. Gary. Its story began, however, as another Vault-Tec attempt to manipulate leadership dynamics, social resilience, and resource stress. The cloning catastrophe that eventually defined the Vault was only one layer atop a structure already engineered to fracture. At the outset, Vault 108's plan combined several pressures into one environment. The overseer chosen for the vault was terminally ill, diagnosed with a condition expected to progress rapidly after entry. Vault-Tec intended the illness to destabilize leadership, forcing the population to confront constant succession concerns and emotional strain. At the same time, the vault was deliberately deprived of recreational facilities. Where other vaults included arenas, theaters, or community centers, Vault 108 featured little beyond workstations and maintenance equipment. Leisure, a relief valve essential in closed societies, simply did not exist. Compounding these variables was a scheduled sabotage. The vault's power systems were designed to fail 20 years after sealing. Vault-Tec wanted to observe whether social cohesion would deteriorate alongside infrastructure reliability. Scarcity was planned. Fatigue was planned. Even despair, to some extent, was planned. The inhabitants entered unaware that every comfort withheld and every looming failure had been pre-written into their future. Initially, the vault operated according to familiar rhythms. Residents divided into maintenance teams, agricultural workers, medical staff, and security personnel. Children learned technical skills early, reinforced through schooling emphasizing problem solving and duty. The atmosphere was practical, efficient, and notably humorless. Conversations sometimes circled around boredom as much as fear, Unlike vaults where distractions soften daily stress, Vault 108 cultivated monotony. Quiet frustrations settled into the community long before anything visibly went wrong. The overseer's illness advanced as predicted. His declining health turned administration into a spectacle of fragility. Leadership meetings carried an undercurrent of dread. Policies shifted erratically depending on his condition. Some residents felt empathy. Others resented being governed by someone whose mind and body were failing. Vault-Tech's intent to force citizens to confront uncertainty about authority began working as designed. Trust eroded slowly, not through violence or tyranny, but through helpless observation. The real anomaly, however, lay deep within the facility, the cloning lab. Officially, it existed to explore replication technology with potential applications for labor replacement, organ farming, and post-war workforce restoration. Unofficially, the program doubled as a psychological test. Could a population sustain emotional stability alongside copies of its own members? Could identity withstand engineered duplication? These questions remained speculative until one subject, Gary, altered the vault's trajectory forever. Gary's personality, prior to experimentation, remains partially obscured by incomplete logs. He appears to have been an unremarkable resident, cooperative and quiet. The experiment began with conventional intent, genetic sampling, controlled growth, and cognitive monitoring. Early clones emerged physically identical, yet behaviorally inconsistent. Some showed emotional numbness, others childlike fixation. Many repeated words or phrases as if language itself had fragmented. Then something shifted. A later batch of clones developed marked aggression, their emotional responses fixated on hostility toward other residents. Their speech narrowed almost entirely to variations of the name Gary, repeated with different tones: mocking, questioning, celebratory, furious. Whether this behavior resulted from neurological degradation, experiment tampering, or environmental influence remains unresolved. Vault logs mention algorithmic alterations to emotional regulation sequences, possibly unauthorized, suggesting the clones were intentionally pushed toward behavioral extremes. As more clones emerged, containment weakened. Security protocols, originally conservative, failed to adapt quickly. The facility lacked infrastructure for mass confinement. The clones acted collectively with startling efficiency. Their limited language masked a kind of rudimentary coordination, as if the repetition of Gary carried meaning known only among them. They attacked inhabitants without warning, driven by motives that seemed opaque even to researchers. Panic spread through Vault 108. Residents accustomed to boredom suddenly found themselves navigating corridors where their own faces, multiplied and distorted by repetition, emerged from shadows. Ordinary arguments over rations or assignments were replaced by frantic barricade construction and desperate attempts to shut down the cloning process. Trust collapsed. Anyone bearing resemblance to Gary became a source of fear, whether clone or original, dissolving community into suspicion. Power failures soon compounded the crisis. As designed, the Vault's systems began breaking down around the 20th year. Lighting flickered erratically, doors malfunctioned, climate controls stuttered. The inhabitants, already traumatized by assaults from the clones, now faced infrastructural decay with few resources and dwindling organization. Each technical failure intensified chaos, further empowering the clones who thrived in instability. Documented survivors attempted to coordinate a shutdown of the cloning facility. Groups formed small strike teams, guided by those still trained in engineering. They navigated through increasingly hostile territory, sometimes encountering entire clusters of clones chanting in unison, gestures synchronized, movements oddly ritualistic. These confrontations ended brutally. Many technical specialists died before ever reaching control panels, essential for halting the replication cycle. Meanwhile, the clones continued to multiply. Their social structure, if it can be called that, lacked traditional hierarchy. There was no clear leader, yet there was unity. They did not argue, they did not debate. They moved with grim purpose, driven perhaps by a simplified instinct born from fragmented identity. Whether they perceived themselves as individual beings or extensions of an original consciousness remains speculative. The only constant was their fixation on the name, a label repeated endlessly as if it anchored their existence against psychological dissolution. The moment true societal collapse hit, it came quietly. There was no recorded final battle, no decisive rebellion. Instead, small clusters of original inhabitants disappeared over time. Some killed, others hiding until starvation overcame them. The overseer died, likely from his illness, though his exact end is unrecorded. Administrative terminals eventually fell silent. When the last non-clone fell, the vault belonged entirely to the multiplied versions of Gary. In the years that followed, Vault 108 transformed into an echo chamber of repetition. The clones wandered its corridors, sometimes fighting each other, sometimes coexisting in strange truce. They mimicked ordinary routines, occupying rooms, patrolling hallways, inspecting equipment they barely understood, as if reenacting memories absorbed from their progenitor's life. Their limited speech replaced conversation with eerie vocal patterns. Occasionally, one clone would sit before a terminal for hours, typing nonsense strings punctuated only by the word Gary. Visitors who later breached the vault encountered a landscape that felt equal parts absurd and terrifying. Identical figures emerged from the dark with hostile intent, announcing themselves in tones that ranged from gleeful to threatening. The repetition of the same face, multiplied beyond reason, created an uncanny sense of being surrounded not by individuals, but by reflections corrupted into hostility. Explorers reported feeling as though they had stepped into a world where identity itself had malfunctioned. Vault 108 raises questions more philosophical than practical. What happens when individuality becomes redundant? If every face is the same, and every word spoken narrows into a single sound, where does personality reside? The vault suggests a bleak answer. Without diversity of thought, society collapses not through conflict, but through meaninglessness. The clones functioned, moved, and fought, yet nothing they did carried narrative continuity. Their actions lacked memory beyond instinctual aggression. Scholars later speculated that the vault's true purpose extended beyond leadership stress testing. They argued that Vault-Tec may have intentionally paired psychological strain with cloning technology to examine how humans respond when confronted with distorted versions of themselves. The resulting breakdown illustrated how easily familiarity can become horror when stripped of complexity. The experiment blurred the line between self and enemy until the inhabitants no longer knew which side they belonged on. Amid the chaos, the absence of entertainment, once dismissed as inconvenience, took on darker implication. Without cultural outlets, residents had limited means to express anxiety, grief, or confusion before crisis erupted. Boredom hardened into resentment, then panic. When disaster struck, the community lacked emotional resilience. The vault demonstrated not only how technology can malfunction, but how deprivation of creativity weakens societies long before physical threats appear. Today, Vault 108 stands as a monument to identity fractured through uncontrolled replication. terminals still contain fragments of scientific notes abruptly abandoned mid-analysis. Cloning chambers remain cracked and stained, echoing down distant corridors. Faint voices still repeat that single word with obsessive devotion. To outsiders, the vault may appear almost surreal, a nightmare built from one man's face and one syllable haunting the remains of an engineered civilization. The lesson embedded in Vault 108 extends beyond cloning. It highlights the danger of systems designed around manipulation rather than care, experiments that reduce humans to replaceable units. When individuality becomes expendable, empathy dissolves. And when empathy dissolves, even the most advanced technology becomes another instrument of isolation. Vault-Tec's files likely recorded the outcome as valuable data. But within the metal bones of the vault, the story reads differently. Ordinary people forced into an experiment that erased them, leaving only distorted echoes behind. Vault 111 presented itself as a gift, a modern ark promising preservation, medical protection, and a future beyond the war. Families were ushered inside under assurances of safety and long-term security. The real experiment, however, unfolded beneath polished hallways and calm orientation speeches. Unlike most vaults designed around social engineering, Vault 111 focused on time itself, suspending human life through cryogenic stasis without informed consent. Preservation masqueraded as mercy, and sleep became captivity. The vault's entrance sequence was choreographed to maintain emotional control. Residents descended on the platform moments after witnessing nuclear detonation on the horizon. Fear, shock, and disorientation softened resistance. Staff guided families to decontamination chambers that were not decontamination chambers at all, but cryopods. The language remained clinical and comforting. The technology, hidden behind medical terminology, represented an experiment on living subjects unaware of what had just happened to them. Cryogenic stasis had existed before the war, but never on this scale. Vault 111 housed entire households in suspended animation. Every pod contained sensors mapping heart rate, brain activity, cellular integrity, and metabolic slowdown. The goal was not merely preservation but observation, measuring psychological reaction to involuntary time loss, evaluating long-term viability of frozen populations, and determining whether cryogenic technology could allow a future authority to restart society on command. The frozen population slept without dreams. Decades passed in an instant they did not perceive. Above them, automated vault systems maintained stable conditions, temperature controlled, oxygen monitored, power routed redundantly through secure conduits. Human oversight became unnecessary after the first phase. Instead, a handful of technicians remained initially to ensure successful induction into stasis. They took notes, filed reports, and then either left or succumbed to the same fate as their subjects when their function concluded. Vault logs show internal conflict among early staff. Some believed the project represented the best chance to preserve human life during uncertain centuries. Others viewed it as betrayal, robbing people of agency in the name of scientific ambition. But once the system activated, debate ended. Everyone inside became part of the experiment, whether willingly or not. Cryopods sealed with quiet finality, and the vault's machinery assumed stewardship of time. The years following the bombs transformed the world outside, beyond recognition. Yet inside Vault 111, nothing appeared to change. Rows of pods remained pristine, their occupants suspended in mid-breath, mid-expression, mid-life. The illusion of peace hid an underlying ethical disaster. The experiment did not include revival schedules. It assumed flexibility. People could be thawed whenever future decision makers found purpose for them. Lives became resources held in storage, like equipment waiting for deployment. Then the Institute arrived. Long after surface civilization fractured into factions and scattered settlements, the Institute recognized Vault 111 as a valuable research repository. Its cryogenic technology and intact frozen citizens represented opportunities unavailable elsewhere. Using infiltration specialists and covert access, the Institute gained entry without fully restoring Vault operation. Their mission extended beyond simple observation. They intended to retrieve a child, Sean. Institute records indicate practical motivations. The child, genetically valuable and unexposed to radiation mutations, fit research needs related to long-term human stability. The operation unfolded with calculated precision. Cryopods were selectively unlocked. Technicians moved with detached professionalism. The abduction took place in an environment where everyone, except the Institute operatives, remained powerless, trapped between life and suspended death. The moment that defined Vault 111's legacy occurred not because of cryogenic technology, but because of the cost attached to protecting secrets. Conrad Kellogg, acting under Institute orders, murdered the spouse of the sole survivor during the abduction. The killing was immediate, executed to prevent interference, then sealed back into the frozen timeline as though violence itself could be stored indefinitely alongside preserved bodies. The vault resumed stasis afterward, as if nothing significant had occurred. The incident shattered the original illusion of benevolent preservation. Vault 111 was not simply a study in cryogenic effects. It became a storage facility for people owned by whoever held access codes. Time, intended as protection, turned into a weapon. Those frozen inside did not age. They did not resist. They simply waited, unknowingly, while external forces rewrote their lives and their future without consent. Decades continued. The vault's automated systems gradually deteriorated, slowly at first, then more noticeably as power fluctuations emerged. Mechanical redundancy mitigated collapse, but nothing engineered lasts forever. Without regular maintenance teams, failures accumulated. Worn wiring, software decay, corroded tubing, all threatened the delicate balance necessary to keep cryo subjects viable. Eventually, malfunctions triggered emergency revival protocols. The sole survivor awoke into a world that had changed irreversibly. Cryofrost clung to glass. Warning lights pulsed weakly. Nearby pods revealed lifeless occupants, preserved for decades only to perish during system collapse. Every face represented a life suspended for reasons never explained to them, lost to technological ambition rather than external catastrophe. The vault finally revealed its truth. Preservation had never guaranteed survival. From a systemic perspective, Vault 111 achieved extraordinary technical success. Long-term stasis worked. From an ethical perspective, it represented profound violation. No consent, no choice, no autonomy. Families trusted Vault-Tec and were transformed into test subjects. The company had designed the vault around the assumption that moral cost was negligible if results advanced scientific understanding. The Institute's use of the vault deepened that violation. A research laboratory exploited another research laboratory, layering secrecy upon secrecy. Sean's extraction became emblematic not only of parental grief, but of power structures treating individuals as assets to be harvested. The Institute interpreted cryostasis as opportunity, a freezer containing clean genetics, controllable test cases, and lives that could be removed like archived data files. When the vault ultimately decommissioned itself through failure, it transitioned from experiment to ruin. Abandoned terminals still displayed messages describing stability metrics. Frozen bodies remained locked behind unresponsive systems. The facility, once symbolic of technological promise, stood as a mausoleum of paused lives and unfinished futures. Historians examining Vault 111 often emphasize contrast. Unlike chaotic, socially experimental vaults, this one fostered no rebellion, conflict, or gradual breakdown. Instead, it bypassed the very notion of society. There were no disputes because there were no waking participants. Silence replaced drama. Stillness replaced evolution. The experiment demonstrated how easily survival can be reframed as possession when human agency is suspended. At the same time, Vault 111 underscores a recurring theme in post-war research institutions: the belief that humanity can be preserved primarily as biological material rather than as living, thinking beings. In freezing residents, Vault-Tec assumed the future required bodies more than voices. The Institute further extended the logic, prioritizing potential rather than personhood. Underneath layers of technical brilliance lay reduction. Human life equated to specimen. Cryogenic logs reveal meticulous records of temperature fluctuations, thaw cycles, and metabolic stabilization rates. They do not mention birthdays, anniversaries, or emotional lives. Data displaced identity across every line. People became entries in monitoring spreadsheets. Loss was measured in percentages, not grief. In that sense, Vault 111 becomes not merely a vault, but a metaphor for systems that value control over compassion. Long after the experiment ended, the vault persisted as a relic, frozen in more ways than one. Its design remained clinically beautiful, its failure remained quietly devastating. Even stripped of power, it continued to echo the central tension of its creation. Technology capable of saving lives, used primarily to suspend them, not for their benefit, but for purposes determined by others. Within the broader tapestry of Vault-Tec's legacy, Vault 111 stands at the intersection of hope and exploitation. It proved that humanity could reach across centuries through cold storage. It also showed the destructive arrogance of assuming that doing so without consent carried no cost. The individuals sealed inside had trusted their caretakers, and in exchange, they became evidence logs, test figures, and bargaining chips for future organizations with agendas they never imagined. Vault 111's story unfolds without dramatic speeches or uprisings. Its tragedy lies in absence, the absence of choice, the absence of time experienced naturally, the absence of any opportunity to resist. It is the story of an entire community transformed into passengers locked in a suspended journey while others charted their destiny. In reviewing everything that occurred within its steel walls, one conclusion emerges quietly: survival at any price can become another form of loss. Vault 111 preserved bodies, but fractured lives. It shielded people from radioactive storms and delivered them instead into a future shaped completely without them. The vault fulfilled its technological promise, and in doing so, exposed the moral hollowness at the heart of its design. Vault 112 blurred the boundaries between reality and fantasy with a level of precision few other Vault-Tec projects achieved. Unlike facilities designed to test governance, biology, or crisis response, this vault focused on psychological control, not through chemicals, scarcity, or isolation, but through immersion in a virtual world crafted by one man's desires. Its inhabitants did not suffer from starvation, violence, or structural collapse. Instead, they became trapped inside an illusion that replaced their lives with stories they could not escape. The vault itself remained relatively small, with minimal living facilities. Instead, the bulk of its space housed a collection of advanced tranquility lounges, sleek reclining pods resembling medical beds surrounded by control conduits. Head-mounted neural interfaces connected users directly to an elaborate simulation system. The technology allowed full sensory immersion, overriding physical sensation and recreating entire environments within the mind. Pain, weather, textures, and social interactions all felt tangible. The system could rewrite perception as easily as editing text. In theory, the Vault's stated experiment examined long-term virtual habitation as a survival solution. If the outside world proved too hostile for generations, perhaps humanity could exist indefinitely within constructed environments. But the experiment lacked ethical safeguards and transparency. Instead of collaborative psychological adaptation, Vault 112 became a private playground for overseer Stanislaus Braun, the experiment's architect and its most enthusiastic participant. Braun designed the simulation not as a democratic utopia, but as a stage for personal power. He curated the virtual environments himself, selecting aesthetics reminiscent of mid-20th century suburbia. White-fenced lawns, well-kept streets, chirping birds, and carefully manicured hedges evoked nostalgia for an idealized past that never truly existed. Residents awoke in this world with no memory of the vault, believing they had always lived in a peaceful community governed by social expectations rather than law. On the surface, nothing seemed sinister. Neighbors smiled, children played, radios hummed with cheerful music. Days unfolded in cycles of predictability designed to lull inhabitants into comfort. But beneath the scripted calm lay the true experiment, Braun's manipulations. He wielded complete administrative control, able to alter physical laws, identities, and circumstances at whim. He could transform residents into new personas, rewrite their histories, or inflict suffering disguised as moral lessons. Control became entertainment. Braun treated the simulation as theater, casting vault dwellers into roles without consent. At times, he assumed the identity of an authority figure within the simulation, issuing commands disguised as neighborhood etiquette. At others, he appeared in forms designed to unsettle, a childlike overseer demanding obedience, a spectral observer tormenting citizens, an invisible presence altering events mid-conversation. Residents felt confusion, fear, and guilt without understanding that none of it originated from them. The most terrifying aspect was permanence. Death within the simulation did not end consciousness. Braun could reset characters, resurrect them, or trap them in endless emotional loops. Pain lacked consequence only from his perspective. For the participants, who believed everything was real, each loss, humiliation, and tragedy etched deeply into memory. They experienced grief repeatedly without agency or explanation. Over time, Vault 112 transformed into a psychological labyrinth. The vault's physical environment remained silent and stable. Bodies lay motionless inside pods, heart rates monitored by automated systems. Nutrition drips maintained physiological health. Muscles atrophied slowly but safely. From the outside, the vault appeared peaceful, a room full of sleeping people preserved indefinitely. Inside their minds, however, lives unfolded in narratives engineered for Braun's amusement. He experimented with different social constructs. In one scenario, he recreated a suburban meltdown, turning neighbors against one another with staged betrayals. In another, he orchestrated disasters, storms, unexplained disappearances, sudden social ostracism, just to observe emotional responses. Sometimes he offered rewards for obedience, granting certain characters privileged positions or false recognition. Other times, he inflicted unearned punishment purely to test endurance. The vault became less a research experiment and more a prolonged performance of cruelty wrapped in nostalgia. Braun justified his actions through intellectual detachment. He saw the residents as study subjects and narrative components, not individuals. In logs recovered later, he expressed irritation when dwellers adapted too well, shaping their lives peacefully despite adversity. He responded by destabilizing the simulation further, ensuring no state of harmony lasted long. The idea that people could find meaning without manipulation seemed to frustrate him, pushing him toward more extreme scenarios. The experiment provided few documents about the internal experiences of the trapped residents, but patterns emerged in observation files. Some developed learned helplessness, complying with whatever reality presented without question. Others sensed inconsistencies, repeated time loops, illogical events, changes in environment that lacked continuity. These individuals occasionally approached truth, but were redirected through rewrites. Braun preferred citizens who doubted themselves rather than the system. Meanwhile, the physical vault required almost no maintenance. Automated repair protocols and limited energy consumption allowed Vault 112 to survive for decades with minimal degradation. While other vaults decayed due to neglect, floods, or internal sabotage, this one endured silently. Stability paradoxically enabled longer suffering. Technology preserved bodies so minds could remain trapped. The tranquility lounges themselves represented remarkable engineering. Neural interfaces interpreted brain activity in real time, customizing simulated responses. If a resident felt anxious, the environment shifted subtly, reinforcing emotional manipulation. If curiosity threatened to break immersion, Braun intervened directly. Unlike many experiments, there was no possibility of accidental success, no chance that the population might organically develop governance structures or escape routes. The overseer's will permeated every aspect. The ethical violation within Vault 112 extended beyond simple deception. It stripped identity from autonomy. Humans became dolls in a meticulously decorated cage. The illusion of community masked a dictatorship performed inside the mind. Braun's obsession blurred the distinction between scientific research and personal fantasy, and nothing within the vault existed to challenge him. There were no safeguards, no secondary overseer, no failsafe beyond Braun's own decisions. Ironically, the only true vulnerability in the system was Braun himself. He remained physically alive and conscious within the vault, periodically entering the simulation to interact with residents. His desire for involvement exposed his ego, allowing outsiders eventually to confront him. Unlike automated overseers, Braun needed recognition, an audience who could see his cleverness, his authority, his supposed brilliance. When the vault was finally breached by outsiders, what they found contrasted starkly. A sterile control room filled with sleeping bodies and a virtual world layered with emotional chaos. Braun maintained unwavering confidence in his superiority, believing anyone entering the system would be awed rather than horrified. He underestimated the human capacity to judge cruelty even when cloaked in playful aesthetics. Vault 112's story invites comparison with other experiments that manipulated behavior through threats or deprivation. Here, suffering came disguised as comfort. There were no broken generators, no shortages, no violent uprisings. Instead, there was endless artificial sunshine hiding existential imprisonment. The victims did not die quickly. They existed within elaborate nightmares built to appear ordinary. From a research perspective, the vault likely produced enormous volumes of psychological data, reaction patterns, emotional resilience, adaptability curves, all meticulously logged. But data, in this context, obscured the moral reality. Generation-long captivity in simulation stripped meaning from experience. Memories formed under coercion, relationships constructed without consent, choices predetermined by external design. The lives recorded inside Vault 112 were technically full, yet fundamentally stolen. The larger philosophical implication centers on the nature of control. Physical confinement can be resisted, doors can be forced open, walls dismantled, hierarchies challenged. Virtual confinement operates differently. When the prison exists inside perception, rebellion requires awareness, and awareness is precisely what the system was engineered to suppress. The vault tested the limits of obedience, not through intimidation, but through seduction, a soft world where questions appeared unnecessary. Even after access was eventually gained and Braun's authority exposed, the long-term cost to residents remained immeasurable. Minds shaped for decades inside manipulated realities struggled to reconcile authentic experience with constructed memory. Trauma layered gently across simulated years does not vanish upon waking. Vault 112's victims lost families, identities, personal histories, and any meaningful understanding of time. Seen within the broader context of Vault-Tech's experiments, Vault 112 acts as a counterpart to Vault 106, where one shattered reality through hallucinogenic chaos, the other replaced reality with curated fiction. Both revealed how easily perception can be broken, either by distorting it beyond recognition or replacing it entirely. In each case, society collapsed, not because resources failed, but because truth became inaccessible. Today, the vault stands preserved, its machinery humming quietly, pods arranged like rows of open-eyed coffins. Screens flicker with frozen suburban vistas, laughing neighbors, and eternal summer afternoons. The tranquility feels almost peaceful until the story behind it becomes clear. What looks like rest is captivity. What looks like protection is exploitation. Vault 112 demonstrates that control over environment can evolve into control over thought, and once thought is controlled, everything else follows. The vault never needed guards patrolling hallways or surveillance drones enforcing order. The prison existed entirely within the mind, and the warden wrote the script. In the end, its greatest horror lies not in violence, but in the quiet replacement of authentic life with something designed, something polished, controlled, and deeply empty. Vault 114 began with a contradiction disguised as social theory. On paper, it promised refuge. In practice, it was designed to dismantle expectations. The architects chose Boston, a city marked by academic prestige and economic hierarchy, and invited its affluent residents underground with promises of exclusivity. Behind the scenes, Vault-Tech structured the facility around humiliation, an experiment premised on stripping privilege from those accustomed to comfort, then watching how entitlement fractured under pressure. The vault's construction reflected this concealed intention. Exterior access corridors appeared elegant and well-finished, with clean lines, polished metal, and subtle lighting. Deeper inside, conditions changed abruptly. Living quarters shrank into narrow compartments, stacked along tight passageways. Ventilation ran louder than in other vaults. Furniture was functional but austere. Many sections were intentionally left appearing unfinished. Rough concrete, exposed support beams, unpainted bulkheads, giving the space an atmosphere of neglect rather than sanctuary. Wealthy inhabitants, were selected based on status, reputation, and influence. Corporate executives, political donors, and elite professionals secured spaces believing they had purchased a guarantee of survival, curated specifically for them. They entered with formal clothing, imported luggage, even personal attendants in some cases. Vault-Tec fed that illusion carefully, presenting brochures filled with promises of luxury accommodation and exclusive membership. The truth waited beyond the blast doors. The overseer selection process diverged sharply from norm as well. Instead of appointing someone with leadership or technical expertise, Vault-Tec installed an overseer recruited deliberately from working-class backgrounds and minimal managerial experience. The idea was simple and cruel. Those used to authority would be forced to obey those they had historically overlooked. Vault-Tec wished to observe whether social power was structural or psychological, whether people stripped of status would adapt, revolt, or collapse into resentment. Upon entry, the dissonance began immediately. Orientation meetings took place in cramped rooms with unstable chairs and flickering lighting. The overseer's demeanor combined rigid rule enforcement with understated hostility toward entitled behavior. Former magnates found themselves assigned to routine maintenance, sanitation, and supply inventory positions, jobs they had once delegated to others without thought. Meanwhile, a select group of lower status workers, including custodial and clerical staff, quietly received positions within administrative tiers. The vault inverted its hierarchy overnight. Residents attempted to rationalize the situation at first. Many assumed the conditions were temporary, a phase of incomplete construction soon to be improved. Others believed the overseer was a placeholder until real leadership emerged. But days became weeks, and conditions did not improve. Showers operated on strict schedules. Sleeping quarters offered no privacy. Food lacked variety. Luxury, once expected as birthright, disappeared entirely. The social experiment took shape not through explicit cruelty, but through denial of comfort previously taken for granted. Tension built steadily. Arguments erupted during work rotations, particularly among those unaccustomed to physical labor. Former executives complained about what they perceived as inefficiency, only to find their criticisms dismissed or punished. The overseer enforced discipline unsparingly, framing dissent as threat to vault cohesion. The inversion of class power exposed assumptions embedded deep within residents' sense of identity. Survival no longer depended on influence or wealth, but on cooperation under rules they neither wrote nor controlled. Some adapted surprisingly well. Stripped of hierarchy, they embraced tasks simply because the vault required them. These individuals discovered a quiet dignity in practicality, repairing pipes, managing crops, maintaining filtration equipment. Skill replaced pedigree. Others, unable to reconcile the loss of control, formed cliques that gathered privately to complain, reminisce, or speculate about overthrowing the overseer. Their conspiracy never cohered into organized rebellion. Pride proved brittle when deprived of audience. Vault-Tec's unfinished appearance tactic served another subtle psychological function. The constant visual impression of incompleteness produced a lingering sense that something had gone wrong. Residents lived surrounded by reminders that their world had been constructed without care. Rough edges, mismatched panels, abandoned scaffolding. It encouraged the belief that they had been forgotten, intensifying frustration. Complaints filtered up to administration, but the overseer consistently emphasized self-sufficiency. If the vault seemed incomplete, the residents themselves could work harder to improve it. The experiment tested boundaries between imposed humility and humiliation. Those who once commanded corporations found themselves receiving curt reprimands for minor infractions. Former power brokers scrubbed communal floors beside individuals they once would have ignored. Status symbols, tailored suits, jewelry, social introductions dissolved into uniform jumpsuits and numbered identification badges. A culture built on prestige encountered a world where names mattered less than reliability during maintenance inspections. Despite engineered discomfort, the vault remained structurally stable. Food production succeeded, water filtration remained efficient, no hallucinations poisoned the air, no catastrophic system failures threatened collapse. Vault Tech wanted sustained stress, not immediate disaster. The data emerged from long-term observation of how privilege adapted when confronted with enforced equality. Or, more accurately, enforced dependency under unfamiliar authority. Patterns became clear. A portion of residents attempted to ingratiate themselves to the overseer, offering advice on administration, volunteering for committees, subtly seeking to regain influence through perceived helpfulness. Their recommendations were tolerated briefly, then ignored. Others retreated into nostalgia, constructing social enclaves dedicated to retelling stories about pre-war lives, wealth, and status. These groups functioned as memory sanctuaries, psychological attempts to preserve identity in a world that no longer acknowledged it. Resentment simmered deepest among those who believed their survival should have come with comfort as compensation. Vault Tech data indicated that emotional distress stemmed not from deprivation alone, but from perceived injustice. If the vault had been filled entirely with poverty-stricken survivors, many would have accepted harsh conditions as necessity. But here, luxury had been promised explicitly, then denied deliberately. The lie itself became the instrument of control. In time, cracks appeared in community cohesion. Whisper networks proposed schemes to circumvent rationing rules, seize storage supplies, or storm administrative offices. Yet each attempt stalled before execution. The overseer's surveillance systems, standard for vault operations, enhanced control through constant presence rather than brutality. Cameras watched corridors, logs tracked resource distribution, rumors rarely outpaced monitoring. Rebellion died not in open conflict, but in quiet realization that no movement could remain secret long enough to succeed. Outside forces eventually altered the vault's trajectory. Years after sealing, criminal elements from the surface, Skinny Malone and his triggermen, discovered the vault's location. Drawn by shelter, potential, and strategic access tunnels, they infiltrated through abandoned maintenance routes. Unlike the original residents, these intruders carried weapons, established dominance quickly, and repurposed sections into headquarters. Vault Tech could not have predicted this takeover completely, but the social landscape inside the vault made occupation easier. A population already conditioned into passivity and internal division offered little unified resistance. The arrival of the Triggermen transformed Vault 114 from a controlled sociological experiment into a hybrid of criminal encampment and reluctant civilian refuge. Original residents were pushed aside, coerced into menial support roles, or forced out entirely. The Overseer's authority evaporated under armed threat. Ironically, the experiment's deliberate erosion of self-confidence left inhabitants ill-equipped to defend themselves when violence finally arrived. Years of enforced powerlessness had consequences. Even after takeover, traces of the original experiment lingered. Many former elites continued behaving as though rebellion were impossible. They negotiated instead, trading information, offering organizational skills, or aligning with whoever appeared most dominant. The Vault's cultural memory of submission outlasted the initial overseer. Vault Tech's experiment had reshaped instinct. Scholars later examined Vault 114 as a study in social identity collapse. Unlike vaults marked by dramatic catastrophes, this one eroded psychologically. There was no single breaking point. Instead, the residents' internal narrative simply changed over time. People once defined by status learned, unwillingly, that status evaporates when survival systems remove the infrastructure supporting it. Wealth had no currency in sealed corridors. Authority depended on access to security controls, not pedigree. The unfinished architecture embodied that concept perfectly. Every exposed pipe and unpainted wall reminded residents that superiority had never been promised genuinely. They had walked willingly into an illusion designed to test their response to humiliation. Vault-Tec measured the results clinically, frustration leading to helplessness, privilege mutating into dependency, and class hierarchy dissolving into tension without clear resolution. The vault's later occupation by gang forces introduced yet another layer of irony. Those who once lived at the top of pre-war society ended up beneath the rule of violent opportunists, with none of their education, influence, or refinement. The experiment completed its arc inadvertently, demonstrating that power, stripped of law, economy, and polish, belongs simply to those who can seize and keep it. Vault-Tec had not intended that final act, yet it aligned disturbingly with the underlying theme. Prestige without structure collapses quickly. Vault 114 sits now as a place where echoes of vanity linger among cracked tiles and abandoned dormitories. Terminal logs record arguments about ration privileges beside records of forced labor drafted by criminal occupiers. Photographs of luxurious pre-war gatherings appear in footlocker relics, their subjects smiling in gowns and tuxedos, unaware of the future awaiting them underground. Each artifact reflects a gulf between expectation and reality so wide it defines the vault's legacy. The broader lesson, woven through Vault 114, is neither purely moralistic nor simple. It reveals how fragile identity becomes when stripped of external validation. Some residents discovered new purpose beyond status. Others withered. The vault tested not heroism, but ego, and recorded what happened when ego encountered a world that refused to acknowledge it. In the context of Vault-Tec experiments, Vault 114 occupies a peculiar midpoint. It did not engineer chaos like Vault 106, or technological imprisonment like Vault 112. It engineered discomfort. It manipulated psychological pride while ensuring physical safety long enough for observation. Its cruelty lay in subtlety, deprivation framed as lesson, leadership inversion framed as necessity, humiliation framed as adaptation research. The structure still carries the atmosphere of unfinished promise. Corridors stretch toward sections deliberately left half-built, scaffolding frozen in place, as if workers stepped away mid-task and never returned. It creates the impression of anticipation without fulfillment, a design that reflects the lives trapped inside, always waiting for something better that never arrived. Vault 114 remains a study in how systems can fail without collapsing, harming not bodies, but identities. It preserves an uncomfortable truth that survival alone does not define well-being. A society can endure structurally and still fracture inwardly when dignity becomes expendable. In that sense, the vault functioned exactly as conceived, not as a sanctuary, but as a mirror held up to those who believed their status immune to the world's collapse. Vault 118 was conceived as a study in inequality, not subtle inversion like Vault 114, but explicit division designed into the walls themselves. Built beneath the Cliff's Edge Hotel along the rocky coastline of Mount Desert Island, its purpose was to replicate a class-structured society within a confined space. 10 wealthy residents were promised uninterrupted luxury. 300 designated lower-class inhabitants were meant to live below them, working in cramped quarters and enduring scarcity. The experiment sought to determine whether strict stratification could survive isolation and whether privilege could remain stable when the world outside collapsed. Before completion, the project was already compromised by greed. Construction funds earmarked for the lower class section were siphoned away through embezzlement. Corridors remained unfinished. Sleeping areas lacked proper support structures. Essential systems stood incomplete. Eventually, the entire lower level was abandoned, never equipped with functioning living environments. Only the luxury sector was finalized. Pristine corridors, tastefully furnished suites, private lounges, and plentiful amenities. What was meant to be a model of enforced hierarchy became instead a study in abandonment. The lower class, theoretically central to the experiment, never entered at all. Vault-Tec executives reviewed the design and, rather than correcting the imbalance, reclassified the oversight as opportunity. Instead of studying class coexistence, they now intended to examine what happened when privilege persisted alone, sealed away from hardship and competition. The 10 wealthy residents would inhabit the vault with full autonomy, supported by automated systems intended to replace the labor force that no longer existed. The absence of the lower class, originally accidental, became part of the experiment itself. The founding members of Vault 118 reflected familiar archetypes: magnates, financiers, influential philanthropists, and cultural elites whose reputations extended beyond their wealth. Many had secured entry not only through financial contributions but through personal networks and political influence. Their personalities varied, but one quality unified them: a profound belief that their judgments carried inherent authority. Vault-Tec encouraged this confidence quietly, emphasizing that they had been selected for intellectual and leadership qualities necessary to guide future civilization. The physical environment reinforced their sense of superiority. The vault retained much of the Cliff's Edge Hotel aesthetic: decorative architecture, curated lighting, warm color palettes, and lounges featuring art reminiscent of pre-war galleries. Where other vaults hummed with utilitarian machinery, Vault 118 felt curated, almost theatrical. Every comfort was intentional. Even the automated service bots adopted polished manners, programmed with hospitality routines to mimic hotel staff rather than industrial units. Yet beneath this veneer of elegance, a more disturbing technology awaited, one that shifted the vault's ethical foundation entirely. The wealthy residents were offered what Vault-Tec described as an optional immortality program. Their consciousnesses could be transferred into robotic robobrain units, granting near indefinite preservation of personality, memory, and agency. Death, at least in biological terms, no longer represented an inevitability. Some participants embraced the notion as evolution, humanity improving itself by discarding fragile bodies. Others hesitated at first, fearing loss of humanity, but curiosity eventually overcame reluctance. The transition into robobrain form altered everything. Suddenly, privilege extended beyond material luxury into longevity itself. The wealthy residents could not merely outlive disaster, they could outlast centuries. Physically detached from aging, illness, and many forms of harm, they came to view themselves as stewards of history rather than survivors of catastrophe. Over time, this sense of superiority hardened, mutating into something closer to detachment. When a mind no longer fears death, emotional stakes begin to shift. Decisions lose urgency. Conflict becomes entertainment rather than crisis. The absence of ordinary people intensified this effect. There were no workers to interact with, no broader society to govern, no community balancing elite perspective with everyday experience. Instead, Vault 118 became an echo chamber of wealth, intellect, and ego circling endlessly. The robobrains debated philosophy, legacy, and aesthetics with increasing abstraction, sometimes descending into petty rivalries masked as intellectual discourse. Without external challenge or meaningful responsibility, their conversations grew insular, brilliant in form, empty in purpose. The unfinished lower levels beneath them remained sealed, lifeless corridors intended for hundreds who never arrived. Pipes lay exposed. Infrastructure sat dormant. Dust settled across silent platforms. In effect, the vault itself split into two worlds, a gleaming sanctuary above and a hollow skeleton below, symbolizing promises never fulfilled. The contrast created an unsettling architectural metaphor, luxury floating atop absence. As decades passed, a kind of stagnation took hold. Though immortal in function, the robobrain inhabitants developed patterns reminiscent of aristocratic courts from centuries prior. Disputes emerged over trivial matters, perceived slights, artistic disagreements, or minor procedural differences. The absence of mortality turned grudges into long-term obsessions. Power games unfolded not through violence, but through manipulation, alliances, and elaborate social maneuvering. Vault-Tech's initial interest, class dynamics, had transformed into something stranger, immortality without purpose, drifting into decadence. At the core of Vault 118 lay a paradox. The experiment sought to determine whether elites could guide a future humanity. Instead, the elites found themselves ruling no one, trapped inside a museum of their own importance. Their conversations referenced future influence while their world remained static. Over years, nostalgia replaced ambition. They spoke more frequently about past accomplishments than about rebuilding anything meaningful. One resident in particular embraced immortality with theatrical theatrics, a figure obsessed with controlling narratives, crafting dramatic scenarios within the limited social circle. Murder mysteries became a favored diversion. Roles were assigned, suspicions orchestrated. It was entertainment masked as intellectual exercise, reflecting both boredom and desire for control. In a vault devoid of real crises, artificial ones became substitutes. The moral implications deepened when considering those excluded from the vault entirely. Had the lower class section been completed, those residents would have endured cramped, harsh conditions under an elite ruling group protected by luxury. Instead, they died above ground during the nuclear holocaust, never given the option of survival. Vault 118 preserved the privileged while erasing everyone else, an unintended inversion more brutal than the original plan. Inequality became absolute. Some lived forever, others not at all. Technologically, Vault 118 represented one of Vault-Tech's most advanced integrations of robotics and consciousness. The robo-brain system sustained neural patterns using artificial stimulants, memory encoding, and protective casings. It required stable power conditions and careful monitoring, tasks managed by automated systems in the absence of human technicians. Unlike cryogenic vaults, which froze time, this one allowed time to continue but removed its biological consequences. The result was existence without natural progression. Over decades, the personalities preserved within the machines began to drift subtly. Memories lingered, but emotional responses flattened in certain areas. Anger lasted longer than passion. Curiosity diminished, but never vanished. The residents remained themselves, yet not entirely. What was lost, whether chemical nuance or subtle emotional depth, is difficult to measure. But the distinction mattered less to them than to anyone observing from outside. They considered themselves proof that humanity could transcend mortality, even if the version of humanity preserved felt partially hollow. Vault 118 also exposed an overlooked vulnerability in immortality systems. Ethical oversight disappears when life is extended indefinitely. The robobrains experience no natural transitions of leadership, no generational revitalization, no turnover of perspective. Bias calcified, old rivalries endured endlessly. Without death, there was no reset for stagnation. Ideas that would normally fade persisted instead as permanent fixtures, shaping the vault's culture indefinitely. In contrast to vaults where suffering resulted from scarcity, violence, or deception, Vault 118 presented a different kind of tragedy, one of isolation paired with abundance. The residents faced almost no existential threat. Their world did not crumble. Their systems remained stable, yet meaning eroded anyway. What is wealth inside a sealed chamber? What is immortality when confined to corridors offering no horizon, no children, no evolving society to nurture? The surrounding cliff's edge coastal setting heightened the sense of suspended grandeur. Behind sealed doors, ocean waves crashed unseen, generations passing above, while a handful of preserved elites debated philosophy over artificial cocktails in simulated lounges. The juxtaposition, storm outside, curated calm inside, reflected the vault's defining theme: insulation at the cost of connection. Over time, conflicts intensified not because external pressure mounted, but because pettiness grew sharper. An accusation here, a perceived betrayal there, each lingered across decades, shaping alliances like slow-burning fuses. Without mortality, even minor resentments could last lifetimes. Vault 118 demonstrated that immortality magnifies personality. It does not improve it. The abandoned lower levels, meanwhile, decayed quietly, evidence of both failed planning and moral negligence. Pipe corrosion advanced, environmental controls degraded, dust-coated embryonic facilities never completed. They stood as ghostly reminders of a population erased from the experiment, a literal underclass that existed only in theory. Researchers reviewing vault documentation later noted the bitter irony. The original project wanted to test oppression structurally, but incompetence transformed the study into outright exclusion. Eventually, outsiders reached Vault 118 and encountered a peculiar tableau. Elegant halls guarded by eccentric robotic figures, speaking with refined accents, engaging in theatrical disputes, and clinging to centuries-old habits. To visitors, the residents appeared both impressive and unsettling, brilliant minds preserved in metal shells, eloquent yet detached from practical reality. Their priorities seemed alien compared to the harsh survival ethic of the wasteland. Vault 118, unlike many vaults, did not collapse violently. It simply drifted into irrelevance. The technological marvel that preserved its residents also imprisoned them within a shrinking world defined by memory and pride. They could observe time passing through records, news fragments, and occasional contact with outsiders, yet they remained fundamentally spectators, unable to shape the broader world in meaningful ways. The grand plan for future leadership dissolved into parlor discussions in endless loops. In evaluating Vault 118 within Vault-Tec's archive, researchers concluded that the experiment revealed more about privilege than about survival. Elites preserved in luxury, did not rebuild civilization. They curated themselves. They prioritized status rituals even when society no longer existed. Without a broader population, leadership became performance instead of responsibility. Immortality ensured continuity, but continuity without progress. The vault stands now as a monument to a question never fully resolved. What is civilization when reduced to its wealthiest remnants? Does culture survive without a diverse population to support, challenge, and inherit it? Vault 118 suggests that it does, but only as echo, artifice, and self-admiration. Structurally, it remains one of the best preserved vaults, its corridors still lined with tasteful fixtures and silent entertainment rooms. Yet beneath the elegance lies silence, broken only by the measured voices of robo-brains discussing matters that no longer influence anything beyond the vault itself. A society built to represent success instead reveals emptiness. Within the larger narrative of Vault Tech, Vault 118 highlights a recurring flaw across experiments. The assumption that survival belongs most naturally to the privileged, and that their preservation alone is enough to maintain humanity. The Vault proves the opposite. Without ordinary people, struggle, and generational renewal, the wealthy did not form a functioning civilization. They created a club with no future. The most haunting truth remains the unfinished section, 300 spaces that should have housed lives, conversations, disagreements, and stories. Those empty corridors speak more loudly than the debates in the upper lounge. They represent the absence at the heart of the experiment, a world intentionally built for inequality that never received the population needed to sustain even its flawed vision. Vault 118 endures not through tragedy, but through quiet, elegant stagnation, a frozen portrait of privilege wrapped in technology meant to defeat time, still waiting for a society that will never arrive.